Britain is on course for Brexit. No point in mincing my words. That's what the polls at the moment show. Now, the polls could be wrong. They were at the last general election. But the trend seems to be that undecided voters are breaking for Leave. It was put to me by a senior Remain campaigner that the usual, supposedly, swing back to the status quo that happens during most referendum campaigns, that should still happen unless the world has turned upside down. But arguably it has, otherwise Donald Trump wouldn't be the Republican presidential nominee.
Is it offensive? You tell me. Oh, really? Oh, I'm sorry about that.
Hillary Clinton wouldn't have faced such a tight campaign against a septuagenarian Jewish socialist, nor, of course, would Jeremy Corbyn be leader of the Labour Party. Neither would Podemos in Spain now be winning the support of millions of Spaniards. Normal rules do not apply. Anti-establishment sentiment is sweeping across the Western world, and that sentiment is going in lots of different directions. Now, I don't think voting Leave is a vote against the establishment, because it means replacing these people with these people. But that's still what the sentiment is partly driving it. The other, of course, is that anti-immigration sentiment has been steadily increasing for many, many years. Now, I'm not saying that we should shut down people's concerns about immigration or dismiss people for being racist or anything like that. We should have a rational discussion in this country about immigration. But it seems to me that all too often, even if you think immigration is a problem, we're not talking about many of the other problems that this country faces. The failure of politicians to build housing, to defend secure jobs by having industries being destroyed in this country because of government policies, whether it be the failure to defend people's living standards, cuts which have put huge pressure on public services. I would prefer to wake up on Friday the 24th to a pleasant surprise. Britain's voted to stay within the European Union. But as things stand, I think Britain is obviously heading towards Brexit. If that is the case, we have to be prepared. Unless we start preparing now and thinking things through, then what will happen will be brutal. The right wing of the Conservative Party will take over. I've campaigned against David Cameron in some form or other, probably every single day he's been Prime Minister. But it is a failure of imagination to not realise how much worse things could get. And what we'll see, almost certainly, is the resignation of David Cameron and George Osborne, and the faction of the Conservative Party to their right will take over. And they will be riding a wave of triumphalism and euphoria on the part of those who wanted to leave the European Union. Boris Johnson, as things stand, is already one of the most popular politicians, if not the most popular politician in this country. A low bar, don't get me wrong, but that's where things stand. And they will then be able to drive through policies which they always wanted to get away with and now can, precisely because we're not members of the European Union. Like workers' rights, which they regard as red tape, workers' rights guaranteed as part of EU membership. An early general election. Some of you are probably thinking, yeah, bring it on, can't wait, here's our big chance to get rid of them. I'm afraid to say that could not be more misplaced. If there's a vote to remain, the Brexiteers within the Conservative parties will be absolutely furious and will make David Cameron and George Osborne's lives miserable. That will not be the case reversed. Most of the Conservative Party, not least the membership, will be perfectly happy with a Brexit, so they will be united.
There seems to be a pattern developing here.
Labour, on the other hand, well, we can expect a coup attempt against Jeremy Corbyn. Even if that doesn't happen, it will underline how fractious the current Labour Party is. If, under those circumstances, there's a general election, we can expect them, I'm afraid, to win, and not just win, but win handsomely. The NHS, we need a massive campaign now to defend the NHS. As that well-known lefty, the former Conservative Prime Minister John Major put it.
The NHS is about as safe with them as a pet hamster would be with an ink-hungry python.
These are people who are on record supporting the privatisation of the NHS, its replacement with a private insurance system and the introduction of private charging. We will have to defend the NHS from that coming onslaught. Tax avoidance. The rich, as we know, avoid tax on an industrial scale, both large companies and wealthy private individuals. The EU has been forced to take action on tax avoidance because of campaigning across Europe. The right wing of the Conservative Party that take power, don't expect that to happen from them. The protection of jobs. Inevitably there will be an economic shock. I'm not going to tell you how big that shock will be because I have absolutely no idea. But I know that right-wing conservatism is completely opposed ideologically to the government intervening to shore up and support industry. So in terms of defending secure jobs, again, that will have to be one of our main priorities. There is panic across the European Union at the moment, not just because Britain will be the first EU member state to leave the EU, but it will be a huge member state and it will set a precedent for leaving. In EU circles, in governments across the European continent, they believe that that precedent could end up setting off a domino effect, which could end up with the implosion of the entire European Union. There is anti-EU and anti-immigration sentiment sweeping the EU at the moment, which they fear will be bolstered by a Brexit. They also fear their populations are already resentful of Britain, which they think gets special treatment. If they all face an economic shock from Brexit, which is of course very likely, that will cause anger, frustration and resentment, which they will cater for. The way they behave will not be retribution, it won't be revenge, it will literally be driven by a determination to survive. And that will mean blocking any attempts to give Britain any favourable deals. Not only will those negotiations go on for many, many years, if they come up with a deal with Britain, one of the things they'll probably end up doing is, you've guessed it, putting the terms to a referendum by their own country. Now, what that will mean for how Britain will be treated, I don't know. How isolated we will become. Anti-immigration sentiment, as things stand, is only likely to increase. Why is that? Well, unless there is a proper economic meltdown as a result of Brexit and people literally just flee the country, then there's no real reason to suggest that mass immigration in this country will decline in any noticeable way. Most immigrants coming into this country come from outside the European Union. And indeed, even if we just excluded all EU migrants, Britain would still be way over the government's official target. At the moment, we're forced to get immigrants to come into the country, take, for example, nursing. Because of cuts to nurse training places year after year after year, last year the government was forced to recruit 1 in 4 nurses from abroad. Now, what will happen if people suddenly look around and think, well, I voted for this because I wanted a massive reduction in immigration, but it hasn't happened? Well, they'll get ever more angry. A war of the generations. There is already tension, latent tension between the generations. But that's because older people, in terms of pensions and all the rest, have largely been protected from cuts. Younger people have faced the brunt of it. We know from the polling that older Britons are the most likely to support leave, whilst younger Britons, particularly 18 to 25-year-olds, overwhelmingly support remaining within the European Union. If Britain leaves the EU, and the consequences of that are most keenly felt by younger people, then those tensions will only escalate. The dismantling of the United Kingdom. As we know, if Britain votes to leave, it's very likely that Scotland will have voted to remain. That will only escalate the huge bitterness and resentment that people feel in many communities in Scotland. Yeah, the case for independence, you think, has been massively undermined because it was partly based on oil prices, which have since collapsed. But if Britain has a massive economic shock that hits Scotland because of a decision they didn't want to happen, then you can quite clearly see why there would be huge appetite for a second independence referendum and how that could be won. So given Brexit is a very likely possibility at the moment, we have to start preparing now for all of these things. A takeover by the hard right of the Conservative Party. An early general election that the Conservative Party, under a right-wing leadership, will be in a very good place to win. An attack on workers' rights, a further renewed attack on the NHS by people who don't want it to even exist. To take a stand on tax justice, retribution from a European Union which will fear for its very future existence, an escalation of anti-immigration sentiment, a war of the generations, and the dismantling of the United Kingdom. This is an attempt to swing the referendum because this video won't do it. Of course it won't. It will only reach a very limited number of people. But I hope the number of people it reaches is enough to prepare for all of these coming battles, of which there are many. Sometimes fear is scaremongering, but sometimes fear is realism in the face of danger. And I can't help but look at the future of this country and see many, many grave dangers. Sorry, not my cheeriest video today. I want to hear your thoughts. Is Brexit inevitable? Are the polls wrong? Will there be a swing back to Remain? Have I just completely over-egged all of these dangers and actually Brexit will be absolutely fine after all? Well, I want to hear from you, so leave your comments as ever. Share the video, subscribe. I'll see you next time.